So, in my search for how I can live and feel good about myself, so chapter 6, and this is kind of, I don't know if this was intentional or if it just kind of happened this way, but chapter 6 on page 66, 666, the chapter is titled Satanic Sex. And I don't know what kind of time you have, or if you are even interested in this, really, but in this video I am going to read the entire chapter on satanic sex. It's not really that long. I think it's like 5 pages, but to my great surprise, there are a lot of explanations about half the chapter is actually about masturbation, which was very helpful to me, because ever since I reached puberty, I have been masturbating, and I've always been told that that was wrong and sinful. But how could it be sinful if it feels so good and it's a natural process? Anyways, this is chapter 6, called Satanic Sex. And let's begin. I'm going to read this out to you directly from the book. Much controversy has arisen over the satanic views on free love. It is often assumed that sexual activity is the most important factor of the satanic religion, and that willingness to participate in sex orgies is a prerequisite for becoming Satanist. Nothing could be farther from the truth. In fact, opportunists who have no deeper interest in Satanism than merely the sexual aspects are emphatically discouraged. Satanism does advocate sexual freedom, but only in the true sense of the word. Free love in the satanic concept means exactly that. Freedom to either be faithful to one person or to indulge your sexual desires with as many others as you feel is necessary to satisfy your particular needs. Satanism does not encourage orgiastic activity or extramarital affairs for those to whom they do not come naturally. For many, it would be very unnatural and detrimental to be unfaithful to their chosen mates. To others, it would be frustrating to be bound sexually to just one person. Each person must decide for himself what form of sexual activity best suits his individual needs. Self-deceitfully forcing yourself to be adulterous or to have sexual partners when not married just for the sake of proving to others, or worse yet, to yourself, that you are emancipated from sexual guilt is just as wrong by satanic standards as leaving any sexual need unfulfilled because of ingrained feelings of guilt. Many of those who are constantly preoccupied with demonstrating their emancipation from sexual guilt are in reality held in even greater sexual bondage than those who simply accept sexual activity as a natural part of life and don't make a big to-do over their sexual freedom. For example, it is an established fact that the nymphomaniac, every man's dream girl and heroine of all lurid novels, is not sexually free, but is actually frigid and roves from man to man because she is too inhibited to ever find complete sexual release. Another misconception is the idea that ability to engage in group sexual activity is indicative of sexual freedom. All contemporary free sex groups have one thing in common: discouragement of fetishistic or deviant activity. Actually, the most forced examples of non-fetishistic sexual activity, thinly disguised as freedom, have a common format. Each of the participants in an orgy removes all clothing, following the example set forth by one, and mechanically fornicate, also following the leader's example. None of the performers consider that their emancipated form of sex might be regarded as regimented and infantile by non-members who fail to equate uniformity with freedom. The Satanist realizes that if he is to be a sexual connoisseur and truly free from sexual guilt, he cannot be stifled by the so-called sexual revolutionists even more than he can be the prudery of his guilt-ridden society. These free sex clubs miss the whole point of sexual freedom. Unless sexual activity can be expressed on an individual basis, which includes personal fetishes, there is absolutely no purpose in belonging to a sexual freedom organization. Satanism condones any type of sexual activity which properly satisfies your individual desires, be it heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, or even asexual if you choose. Satanism also sanctions any fetish or deviation which will enhance your sex life, so long as it involves no one who does not wish to be involved. The prevalence of deviant and or fetishistic behavior in our society would stagger the imagination of the sexually naive. There are more sexual variants than the unenlightened individual can perceive. Transvestism, sadism, masochism, urolagnia, exhibitionism, to name only a few of the more predominant. Everyone has some form of fetish, but because they are unaware of the preponderance of fetishistic activity in our society, they feel they are depraved if they submit to their unnatural yearnings. Even the asexual has a deviation, his asexuality. It is far more abnormal to have a lack of sexual desire unless illness or old age or other valid reason has caused the wane, than it is to be sexually promiscuous. However, if a Satanist chooses sexual sublimation above overt sexual expression, that is entirely his own affair. In many cases of sexual sublimation or asexuality, any attempt to emancipate himself sexually would prove devastating to the asexual. Asexuals are invariably sexually sublimated by their jobs or hobbies. All the energy and driving interest which would normally be devoted to sexual activity is channeled into other pastimes or into their chosen occupations. If a person favors other interests over sexual activity, it is his right, and no one is justified in condemning him for it. However, the person should at least recognize the fact that this is a sexual sublimation. Because of lack of opportunity for expression, many secret sexual desires never progress beyond the fantasy stage. Lack of release often leads to compulsion, and therefore a great number of people devise undetectable methods of giving vent to their urges. Just because most fetishistic activity is not outwardly apparent, the sexually unsophisticated should not delude himself into thinking it does not exist. To cite examples of the ingenious techniques used, the male transvestite will indulge in his fetish by wearing feminine undergarments while going about his daily activities. Or the masochistic woman might wear a rubber girdle several sizes too small so she may derive sexual pleasure from her fetishistic discomfort throughout the day, with no one the wiser. These illustrations are far tamer and more prevalent examples than others which could have been given. Satanism encourages any form of sexual expression you may desire, so long as it hurts no one else. This statement must be qualified to avoid misinterpretation. By not hurting another, this does not include the unintentional hurt felt by those who might not agree with your views on sex because of their anxieties regarding sexual morality. Naturally, you should avoid offending others who mean a great deal to you, such as prudish friends and relatives. However, if you earnestly endeavor to escape hurting them, and despite your efforts they accidentally find out, you cannot be held responsible, and therefore should feel no guilt as a result of either your sexual convictions or their being hurt because of those convictions. If you are in constant fear of offending the prudish by your attitude towards sex, then there is no sense in trying to emancipate yourself from sexual guilt. However, no purpose is served by flaunting your permissiveness. The other exception to the rule regards dealings with masochists. A masochist derives pleasure from being hurt. So denying the masochist his pleasure through pain hurts him just as much as an actual physical pain hurts the non-masochist. The story of the truly cruel sadist illustrates this point. The masochist says to the sadist, "Beat me," to which the merciless sadist replies, "No." If a person wants to be hurt and enjoys suffering, then there is no reason not to indulge him in his want. The term sadist in popular usage describes one who obtains pleasure from indiscriminate brutality. Actually, though, a true sadist is selective. He carefully chooses from the vast reservoir of appropriate victims and takes great delight in giving those who thrive on misery the fulfillment of their desires. The well-adjusted sadist is Epicurean in selecting those on whom his energies will be well spent. If a person is healthy enough to admit he is a masochist and enjoys being enslaved and whipped, the real sadist is glad to oblige. Aside from the foregoing exceptions, the Satanist would not intentionally hurt others by violating their sexual rights. If you attempt to impose your sexual desires upon others who do not welcome your advances, you are infringing upon their sexual freedom. Therefore, Satanism does not advocate rape, child molesting, sexual defilement of animals, or any other form of sexual activity which entails the participation of those who are unwilling or whose innocence or naivete would allow them to be intimidated or misguided into doing something against their wishes. If all parties involved are mature adults who willingly take full responsibility for their actions and voluntarily engage in a given form of sexual expression, even if it is generally considered taboo, then there is no reason for them to repress their sexual inclinations. If you are aware of all the implications, advantages, and disadvantages, and are certain your actions will hurt no one who does not wish or deserve to be hurt, you have no cause to suppress your sexual preferences. Just as no two people are exactly the same in their choice of diet or have the same capacity for the consumption of food, sexual tastes and appetites vary from person to person. No person or society has the right to set limitations on the sexual standards or the frequency of sexual activity of another. Proper sexual conduct can only be judged within the context of each individual situation. Therefore, what one person considers sexually correct and moral may be frustrating to another. The reverse is also true. One person may have great sexual prowess, but it is unjust for him to belittle another whose sexual capacity may not equal his own, and inconsiderate for him to impose himself upon the other person, i.e., the man who has a voracious sexual appetite, but whose wife's sexual needs do not match his own. It is unfair for him to expect her to enthusiastically respond to his overtures, but she must display the same degree of thoughtfulness. In the instances when she does not feel great passion, she should either passively but pleasantly accept him sexually or raise no complaint if he chooses to find his needed release elsewhere, including autoerotic practices. The ideal relationship is one in which the people are deeply in love with one another and are sexually compatible. However, perfect relationships are relatively uncommon. It is important to point out here that spiritual love and sexual love can, but do not necessarily go hand in hand. If there is a certain amount of sexual compatibility, often it is limited, and some, but not all, of the sexual desires will be fulfilled. There is no greater sexual pleasure than that derived from association with someone you deeply love, if you are sexually well suited. If you are not suited to one another sexually, though, it must be stressed that lack of sexual compatibility does not indicate lack of spiritual love. One can, and often does, exist without the other. As a matter of fact, often one member of a couple will resort to outside sexual activity because he deeply loves his mate and wishes to avoid hurting or imposing upon his loved one. Deep spiritual love is enriched by sexual love, and it is certainly a necessary ingredient for any satisfactory relationship. But because of differing sexual predilections, outside sexual activity or masturbation sometimes provides a needed supplement. Masturbation, considered a sexual taboo by many people, creates a guilt problem, not easily dealt with. Much emphasis must be placed on this subject, as it constitutes an extremely important ingredient of many successful magical working. Ever since the Judeo-Christian Bible described the sin of Onan, Genesis 38, 7 through 10, man has considered the seriousness and consequences of this solitary vice. Even though modern sexologists have explained the sin of Onan as simply coitus interruptus, the damage has been done through centuries of theological misinterpretation. Aside from actual sex crimes, masturbation is one of the most frowned upon sexual acts. During the last century, innumerable texts were written describing the horrific consequences of masturbation. Practically all physical or mental illnesses were attributed to the evils of masturbation. Pallor of the complexion, shortness of breath, furtive expression, sunken chest, nervousness, pimples, and loss of appetite are only a few of the many characteristics supposedly resulting from masturbation. Total physical and mental collapse was assured if one did not heed the warnings of those handbooks for young men. The lurid descriptions in such texts would be almost humorous were it not for the unhappy fact that even though contemporary sexologists, doctors, writers, etc., have done much to remove the stigma of masturbation, the deep-seated guilts induced by the nonsense in those sexual primers have been only partially erased. A large percentage of people, especially those over 40, cannot emotionally accept the fact that masturbation is natural and healthy, even if they now accept it intellectually, and they in turn relate their repugnance, often subconsciously, to their children. It was thought one would go insane if, despite numerous admonitions, his autoerotic practices persist. This preposterous myth grew from reports of widespread masturbation by the inmates of mental institutions. It was assumed that since almost all incurably insane people masturbated, it was their masturbation that had driven them mad. No one ever stopped to consider that the lack of sexual partners of the opposite sex and the freedom from inhibition, which is characteristic of extreme insanity, were the real reasons for the masturbatory practices of the insane. Many people would rather have their mates seek outside sexual activity than practice autoerotic acts because of their own guilt feelings. The mate's repugnance towards having them engage in masturbation or the fear of their mate's repugnance, although in a surprising number of cases, a vicarious thrill is obtained through knowledge that the mate is having sexual experiences with outsiders, although this is seldom admitted. If stimulation is provided by envisioning one's mate sexually engaged with others, this should be brought out into the open where both parties may gain from such activities. However, if the prohibition of masturbation is only due to guilt feelings on the part of one or both parties, they should make every attempt to erase those guilts or utilize them. Many relationships might be saved from destruction if the people involved did not feel guilt about performing the natural act of masturbation. Masturbation is regarded as evil because it produces pleasure derived from intentionally fondling a forbidden area of the body by one's own hand. The guilt feelings accompanying most sexual acts can be assuaged by the religiously acceptable contention that your sexual delights are necessary to produce offspring, even though you cautiously watch the calendar for the safe days. You cannot, however, placate yourself with this rationale while engaging in masturbatory practices. No matter what you've been told about the Immaculate Conception, even if blind faith allows you to swallow this absurdity, you know full well if you are to produce a child, there must be sexual contact with a person of the opposite sex. If you feel guilty for committing the original sin, you certainly will feel even deeper guilt for performing a sex act only for self-gratification, with no intention of creating children. The Satanist fully realizes what religionists declare masturbation to be sinful. Like all other natural acts, people will do it, no matter how severely reprimanded. Causing guilt is an important facet of their malicious scheme to obligate people to atone for sins by paying the mortgages on temples of abstinence. Even if a person is no longer struggling under the burden of religiously induced guilt, or thinks he isn't, modern man still feels shame if he yields to his masturbatory desires. A man may feel robbed of his masculinity if he satisfies himself autoerotically rather than engaging in the competitive game of woman chasing. A woman may satisfy herself sexually, but yearns for the ego gratification that comes from the sport of seduction. Neither the quasi-Casanova nor bogus vamp feels adequate when reduced to masturbation for sexual gratification. Both would prefer an inadequate partner. Satanically speaking, though, it is far better to engage in a perfect fantasy than to cooperate with an unrewarding experience with another person. With masturbation, you are in complete control of the situation. To illustrate the undeniable fact that masturbation is an entirely normal and healthy practice, it is performed by all members of the animal kingdom. Human children will also follow their instinctive masturbatory desires unless they have been scolded for it by their indignant parents, who were undoubtedly berated for it by their parents, and so on down the retrocedent line. It is unfortunate but true that the sexual guilts of parents will immutably be passed on to their children. In order to save our children from the ill-fated sexual destiny of our parents, grandparents, and possibly ourselves, the perverted moral code of the past must be exposed for what it is: a pragmatically organized set of rules which, if rigidly obeyed, would destroy us. Unless we emancipate ourselves from the ridiculous sexual standards of our present society, including the so-called sexual revolution, the neuroses caused by those stifling regulations will persist. Adherence to the sensible and humanistic new morality of Satanism can and will evolve society in which our children can grow up healthy and without the devastating moral encumbrances of our existing sick society. That concludes Chapter 6 on Satanic Sex. I was really happy to know that masturbation was covered in great detail there, saying that it was pretty, even now, you know, here it is 2022, and